So for today's movie review, I'll be reviewing In the Heart of the Sea, a 2015 historical adventure drama directed and co-produced by famous filmmaker Ron Howard, who technically needs no introduction, but if you forgot what movies he has directed, he's directed everything from Splash, Cocoon, Willow, Apollo 13, the live-action Jim Carrey How the Grinch Stole Christmas movie, The Da Vinci Code, and so forth. And as far as In the Heart of the Sea itself is concerned, the movie is based on the 2000s nonfiction book In the Heart of the Sea, The Tragedy of the Whaling Ship Essex, which detailed the real-life events of the American whaling ship Essex that was attacked by a sperm whale that would inspire Herman Melville's classic novel of Moby-Dick. As for production of the movie, apparently the movie started development back in 2000, where apparently Barry Levinson was supposed to direct the movie, and this is the same guy who directed movies from 1985's Young Sherlock Holmes, Good Morning Vietnam, 1992's Toys, 4 Miramax movies, but this never happened, and eventually Ron Howard would eventually direct this, making this the overall 6th movie Ron Howard would direct that would be inspired or based on a true event, with the other 5 being, as mentioned earlier, Apollo 13, A Beautiful Mind, Cinderella Man, Frost Nixon, Rush, and Hillbilly Elegy, and the first movie he would direct under Warner Brothers Studios. And this movie was notable for one of 2 reasons. The first reason being that it predominantly featured a comic book cast of actors, ranging from Chris Hemsworth, who's best known for playing Thor in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, along with Tom Holland before he played the role of Spider-Man in Captain America Civil War, and the rest of the Spider-Man MCU movies, along with Cillian Murphy, who was known for playing Scarecrow in the Christopher Nolan Dark Knight trilogy, along with Benjamin Walker, who would play the role of Eric Galden in the 3rd and final season of the, at the time, Netflix Marvel show Jessica Jones. But moving past the comic book actor lineup, the movie was met with very mixed reception upon its release, and was notable for being a box office bomb, grossing $94.3 million against a $100 million budget. Then again, it probably didn't help the fact that 1 week later, Star Wars Episode 7 The Force Awakens would hit theaters, becoming the highest grossing movie of 2015, essentially sweeping In the Heart of the Sea under the rug, and would later be forgotten by the general public, myself included. No, seriously, I forgot this movie even existed until I stumbled upon a Blu-ray DVD copy at a local thrift shop. And I figured, with today being the overall 10th anniversary of In the Heart of the Sea, I figured what better way to celebrate this movie's 10th anniversary than by doing a review of it. Which begs the question, is In the Heart of the Sea an under-recommended classic, or does it belong at the bottom of the sea? As for the plot of the movie, like I mentioned a few minutes ago, this movie was heavily inspired by a story that inspired Moby-Dick. But for those of you who don't know the actual story, it goes something along the lines of this. In the winter of 1820, a whaling company in Nantucket that has refitted the whaling ship Essex to participate in a whale hunt and bring back lucrative whale oil, which could be used to power up cities. And while on the voyage of obtaining said whale oil, the unthinkable happens. The crew of the Essex soon get assaulted by a massive white sperm whale with a will and almost human sense of vengeance, resulting in the sinking of the Essex. And now stranded out to sea, the remaining crew soon fight for survival as they brave storms, starvation, despair, along with having several more encounters with the whale. The men will call into question their deepest beliefs, from the value of their lives to the morality of their trade, as their captain searches for direction in order to find a nearby landmass, while his first mate seeks vengeance upon the great white whale. Now, in terms of what I liked about the movie, I think the movie has a lot of good production values going for it in terms of the costume and set designs. But with the costume designs, look, I'm no expert in terms of historical accuracy to the time period, but the costumes all the characters have look like products of that time period and fit the movie very well. I also like the fact that the filmmakers went out of their way to use a replica of the Essex whaling ship for some of the scenes that occur at sea. Because in this day and age, if this was made by any other filmmaker, that ship probably would have most likely would have been depicted using CGI, which it is in some cases, such as the bit where we see the ship going through a storm or having the ship get attacked by the white bull sperm whale in the middle of the movie. But other than that, it's just nice to see actual practical ships in a movie like this and only use CG when needed. And speaking of which, I also think the CGI used for this movie was very good and has aged very well, even if some of the whales don't look as convincing as others. But other than that, I think the CGI was used as intended. Another aspect of the movie I liked is the visual storytelling that occurs throughout the movie, with one example occurring near the beginning of the movie where we have Owen Chase walking through Nantucket and we have the camera just lingering on some of the civilians, just doing everyday mundane things, showcasing just how this town functions without a single line of dialogue being told. Another great example of visual storytelling is the usage of color in the second half of the movie, because in the first half, everything looks normal as far as color is concerned, but sometime after their ship sinks, the movie has this yellow filter for the remainder of the movie, and I think having the yellow filter for the portions where you have the remaining crew members on the boats as they're drifting out in the middle of the ocean to be very intentional, because the color yellow can mean many things depending on how it's used. For example, if we're looking at the usage of color in a positive way, it usually either means happiness, hope, enlightenment, or honor. But in a negative sense, it could mean cowardice, deception, jealousy, or death and decay. While in some other fashions, it could also mean warning or humility, among many other things. And I think the filmmakers using the color yellow for the second half of the movie makes a lot of sense, contextually speaking. Because going back to the first half of the movie in terms of its color scheme, like I mentioned a few seconds ago, visually speaking, the movie looks normal and doesn't have this yellow filter. But the yellow technically does appear in the form of these golden whaling pins that you see a lot of the crew of the Essex wear on their uniforms. And provided that a lot of these characters are a part of an industry that requires them to hunt whales for their oil for profit reasons, having the color yellow in that instance makes a lot of sense, considering that yellow can mean wealth. Not only that, but we do see Chris Hemsworth's character having several of these pins on him, with the hope that after this voyage, he could become a captain of his own whaling vessel. Fast forward to the second half of the movie where the coloration of the movie has this yellow hue. The color in that instance takes on a whole new meaning that makes a lot of sense, considering that the characters are in a very hazardous situation that actually leads to several of the characters dying over the course of the second half of the movie. So, quite literally, the meaning of the color yellow is used both in a positive and in a negative way, especially with Owen Chase, the character Chris Hemsworth plays in this movie, which I'll discuss in a few minutes. Another aspect of the movie I want to talk about is that of Tom Holland, because prior to him appearing in Captain America Civil War playing the role of the MCU Spider-Man, I have never heard of Tom Holland before that. And I will admit, I haven't really seen him in too many movies outside of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, with the exception of the 2020 movie, The Devil All the Time. So it is nice to see a pre-MCU Tom Holland and see where his career would go from here moving forward. That said, I think one of my favorite scenes with him in it occurs sometime after they succeed in catching a whale, and there's a point in time where you have Tom Holland's character who is forced to crawl inside of a whale's head to retrieve the, quote, good stuff. Because first off, you have Tom Holland crawling inside of a whale's head, which is already a surreal visual visual to see in a movie. Second, again, it adds a lot more details to this industry in terms of what people were willing to do to retrieve whale oil. Third, I like the fact that the filmmakers actually built a 2-scale whale's head for Tom Holland to crawl inside. It adds a sense of tangibility to this universe. And it's also nice to see a practical effect in a movie like this. Another aspect of the movie I want to talk about is the dynamic between Owen Chase and Captain George Pollock Jr. Because I think some of the best parts of the movie are when you have those two interacting with each other, because they're two sides of the same coin. And what I mean by that is that although I might not know all of the historical details surrounding who these men were in real life, watching this movie and seeing how these two interact with each other, I can see how in some shape or form these two together inspired Captain Ahab. Although I will admit, it has been a long time since I've either read or seen an adaptation of Moby-Dick, so my memory of Captain Ahab is a little fuzzy in some areas, but anywho, not only that, but a lot of the movie's tension comes from these two interacting with each other, considering that you have Owen Chase, who's a man that comes from a family of farmers, who does not have any foot planted in the whaling industry. And although he's a very experienced whaler, he wishes to become the captain of his own ship in an attempt to make sure his family name is associated with the industry. On the other side, you have George Pollock, who comes from a line of people who have their foot firmly planted in the whaling industry, and comes from a very wealthy family. And despite all that, he lacks the necessary experience to captain a ship, thus leading to a lot of verbal confrontations with Owen Chase, which does affect a lot of the way they operate as a crew. And while on the topic of Owen, there's a particular scene I want to talk about with him that corresponds with his character arc in relation to the yellow color scheme that I was talking about several minutes ago. That being the point in time where we have the remaining crew members of the Essex getting into their final confrontation with the white sperm whale. Because the color yellow at that moment is very reflective of his entire character arc. Like I said a few minutes ago, the color yellow can mean many things in terms of either meaning wealth, hazard, enlightenment, or hope. And I think we see that in his final moments with the whale, because he's given the opportunity to harpoon the sperm whale, but chooses not to. Because at that moment, he doesn't care about the wealth or death. The only thing keeping him going is the hope of him reuniting with his wife and daughter. Not only that, but logically, it makes sense for him not to attack the whale, considering that at this point in the movie, they're at their weakest, and even if they did manage to attack the whale, none of them were gonna get out of that situation alive, thus sparing him the cruel fate that would occur with Captain Ahab in Moby-Dick. An aspect of the movie I have mixed feelings on revolves around the historical accuracy to the movie in some areas, and before I go any further, I should note that although I know the general basics of the real-life event, I don't know all of the details, but of the details I do know, these were some of the details that were changed around that I thought either worked or didn't work for the movie. With the one detail that was changed around that I personally liked was the fact that the whale appeared more than once throughout the movie, because if you're familiar with the actual story, the whale that attacked the ship itself only showed up the one time and was never seen again, whereas in the movie, the moment it shows up and attacks the ship, it becomes this reoccurring presence seen throughout the remainder of the movie, which in some ways I find to be really funny in a retrospective kind of sense, considering that a lot of major complaints from people who saw the movie around the time of its release complained about the fact that the whale doesn't have that much screen time. But anywho, getting back to the whale, I do like how the whale is given more to do other than just attacking the boat, because they almost make the whale itself its own character in its own way. Because prior to them encountering a whale, you have the crew talking to this one guy who said, yes, you could have made off with several barrels with, everyone asking, could have, I didn't you? And he does tell the story about the white whale, giving a sort of otherworldly vibe to the whale before they encounter it. And the whale itself does seem to have a bit of a personality, because when we first see it, it's merely attacking the boat because it's just defending its pod. And then we see it swimming after them during a storm, almost as if it's stalking the survivors of the whaling ship. And then it attacks them at their lowest, not being able to fight back to the best of their ability. And then the fourth time around, it almost appears as if it's testing the survivors to see whether or not they're going to attack the whale. And if they do so, it would probably just kill them on the spot. But since they choose not to, the whale just leaves them alone. Sure, maybe I'm reading too much into this, but I would like to think that perhaps the whale was given some bit of characterization in the movie for what little screen time it had. Now, as for a piece of historical information that they changed around that I thought was a little unnecessary, was the reason as to why certain members of the crew left the island, because sometime after the whale sank their ship, the surviving members of the whaling crew find an island and try to consume the resources there to survive. Now, in the actual story, there comes a point where you have most of the crew members leave because they believe they consumed all the resources on the island, believing that they'll probably have a better chance out at sea, whereas some stay behind because they believe that the island has more to offer them. While in this movie, yes, technically there is a line of dialogue talking about the fact that some of the birds might not return to the island because they consumed all their eggs, but that's not the reason why some of them choose to leave the island. Because there does come a point where a lot of the crew assume that, hey, if we stay on this island, maybe there'll be a passing ship that'll come and rescue us. And sometime later, they find a cave filled with all of these dead corpses. And some character says, these people look like they've been here for a long time waiting for a ship that never came. And I don't want to share their fate. So you quite literally have some characters go back out to sea and hope for the best while some stay behind. Then you have the death surrounding the captain's cousin. Because in the actual account, the way they chose who was going to get cannibalized was by having pieces of cloth that had some kind of marking on it that signified who was being eaten and who was the one shooting the person getting eaten. With the cousin drawn a lot for being the one to get eaten by everybody else, and the captain stepping in, volunteering to take his place, but the cousin refused, saying it was his right to do so, that the others might live. Meanwhile, in the movie, they draw straws to figure out who gets in or shoots. And the cousin, instead of getting shot, he's the one that grabs the pistol and shoots himself so the others might live. And on the one hand, yes, technically, this does fulfill a sort of character arc he had throughout the movie. I just don't like the way they went about it. Not only that, but I feel like by having the cousin shoot himself in the movie is more of an insult to the actual person it's based on than anything else. Now, in terms of what I disliked about the movie, if you've been around my channel long enough, you would already know that I'm not a particularly big fan of the framing device of having the movie start out in the present day and then have the rest of the movie be a flashback leading up to the present day stuff. I never found this particular framing device to be that engaging, especially with the way this movie goes about it. Because the framing device revolves around Herman Melville talking to an adult Thomas, who recalls a lot of the events that surrounded the sinking of the Essex whaling ship. And having the movie start and end with that isn't too bad, but during the middle portion of the movie, it gets distracting because there are points in time where I found myself to be very engaged with the stuff that occurred with the crew of the Essex, but then there'll be points in time where we randomly cut back to the stuff with Herman Melville, and it's during these points in time that it really took me out of the movie, and I feel like these scenes, in my opinion, could have been removed altogether, with one particular example revolving around the surviving members trying to figure out what to do with a dead body, and while the other character suggests that, hey, that's a valuable resource, we could use that. Moments later, it cuts to the present day stuff with Herman Melville, and you have the survivor discussing in great detail about them cannibalizing the body, and I just didn't think the filmmakers needed to go in that direction, because you have to remember, movies are a visual medium. You use your visuals to tell a story. You know, show, don't tell. And I think the way they could have gone about this particular scene scene is having the characters look at the body. One of them pulls out a knife, and just as you're about to see them cut into the body, you crossfade to some time later with them munching on the bones and tossing the bones off to the side. It gets the same point across without actually having to tell you what happened. Another problem that I have with the movie is one of tone, more specifically in the second half of the movie, because the first half has this adventurous vibe to it, which I think works, but the moment the whaling ship sinks and you have all of the characters stranded out to sea, I think tonally could have been a lot darker, because as it is, it's very unpleasant, but I think it could have been bleaker considering what occurs in the second half of the movie, where you have these characters not only trying to survive physically, they're also trying to survive psychologically. They're committed acts of cannibalism. The list goes on. And I think if the second half of the movie had a much darker tone, I think it would have been a lot better. And to continue with the second half of the movie, another problem I have has to do with the pacing. Because I felt that the pacing for the first half of the movie, outside the first 5 minutes, moved at a pretty brisk pace, going from one scene establishing characters to having the crew hunt the sperm whales. But the moment the ship sank, I felt the pacing slowed down to a halt for the remainder of the movie. And here's the thing, I get that during this stretch of the story, the pacing is meant to be a little slower to really emphasize just how dire the situation is for our characters. But I just think things could have happened a little faster in some areas. Another problem that I have with the movie has to do with the crew of the Essex ship, because outside of our 4 main characters consisting of Owen, Captain George, Matthew, and Thomas, the rest of the crew, to me, are very forgettable and poorly written to a point that not only do I not remember their names, but I don't really remember their personalities, because they do just blend together after a while, with the exception of George's cousin. But even then, outside of being his cousin, I don't remember anything about the character in terms of both personality and name. And I think with a few more rewrites, the filmmakers could have given some of these crewmates a bit more details that could have fleshed them out just enough to make you care about them in some shape or form. Because as it is, we don't know anything about these characters. So for my final verdict of In the Heart of the Sea, I think the movie is a pretty solid action survival movie that gives us a really good performance by Chris Hemsworth outside the Marvel Cinematic Universe, while also giving us the novelty of seeing a pre-MCU Tom Holland before he took on the role of Spider-Man. And on top of that, I thought the movie had some really great production value, from the costumes and set designs to having really good cinematography, along with some good set pieces, no matter if it was the actual bits with the whalers hunting the whales or them simply having conversations with each other. Especially the points in time where you have Chris Hemsworth's and Benjamin Walker's characters verbally talking it out throughout the movie. Although, that all said, I do think the movie suffers from some pacing issues. I think tonally the movie could have been darker in some areas, and I feel that some of the characters, while acted very well, could have benefited from adding more detail to them. And I do feel the points in time where we cut to the present day stuff with Herman Melville talking to an adult Thomas about the events, I think could have been trimmed down a bit, as I did find myself being taken out of the movie anytime we cut to those scenes. But overall, I think In the Heart of the Sea is not only a solid movie, but a movie that was severely misunderstood upon its release. And before I go any further, what did everyone else have to say about In the Heart of the Sea? So it looks like the movie got generally mixed to negative reception. And so for my final rating of In the Heart of the Sea, I give it a 4 out of 5. So what's your favorite Ron Howard movie? And see you later.